reminds us so much of Robert E. Millikan, and you'll see the similarities as we go along. Robert E. Millikan received the Nobel Prize 100 years ago today. And so we need to all be aware of that and be proud of those people. So last fall, to kind of set everything up, Don Wentworth, when we started Brown Bag Lunches again, Don Wentworth did an awesome brown bag lunch that he called a virtual tour of the Andrews Cemetery. And he spoke, if you remember, if you were here, about some of the notable people that are buried in the Andrews Cemetery. Not just a few were brave soldiers from the Revolutionary War down to the present time. So today we're going to focus on this military man, and though he's not buried in the Andrews Cemetery, he was born in Andrew. And his story, like I said, is a little like that of Robert Millikan's. So this is the Andrew Presbyterian Church. One way that he is like Robert Millikan is that Robert was the son of Andrew's Presbyterian minister back then. His name was Leon Artemus Losey, and his wife, this man's mother, was Nellie Moore Losey. So Reverend Losey was a really extraordinary person. He was a 1907 graduate of Princeton University, and we're talking about a man from Andrew, right? He was a 1909 graduate of the Moody Bible Institute of Chicago. He had 8 degrees in, and yet his family members say that his income is about that of a railroad crossing attendant. And the reason is that he believed in small community churches, and this is where he preferred to serve. After leaving Andrew, he went to rural New York State for a while. He went to Wyoming, he went to Montana, and he died in a small town in Montana of appendicitis at the age of 43, and he's buried there. Well, maybe you remember the connection. Robert Millikan grew up in Maquoketa. His father was the pastor of the Congregational Church here that still stands many years before. Silas Millikan was the same kind of man. He was highly educated, but he was dedicated to serving God in what he saw as the humblest of circumstances, rather than seeking fame and fortune in a more influential place. Had Robert Losey been permitted to live a full life, he too may have become a prominent figure like Robert Millikan proved to be. So 2 men from Jackson County that we can be so very proud of. We know that, I'm looking for Doug Noble, but I don't think he's here yet. We know that Robert Losey was born in this house in Andrew. This was the Andrew Presbyterian Church manse, and that is where he was born in 1908. And we have just a few pictures of him from his childhood. He didn't live in Andrew a large number of years. We think he left somewhere in his very early school years. But here's a picture of him, just a young man in Andrew. Very cute. And another picture, these are from his family. Another picture was he and his sister Margaret, and this picture was taken in Andrew. So, like I said, he lived in Andrew. We're not sure just when they left. He lived in Andrew at least through the 1st grade, we believe. And then his father took another position in another small rural church. But when he died, Robert was 12 years old. And so from the time he was 12 years old, he was the man of the family. And his mother and his little sister depended heavily on him. From Wikipedia, we have figured out that he actually graduated from high school in Trenton, New Jersey in 1924. So he was appointed to the United States Military Academy at West Point, quite an accomplishment in itself. And he was appointed in 1925, graduated near the top of his class in 1929. And he left West Point, and he transferred, he was in artillery to begin with, and he transferred to the Army Air Corps. He was commissioned a 2nd lieutenant, as you see, and began his military career. So this is Lieutenant Losey receiving his wings from the Air Force Advanced Flying School in San Antonio, Texas, 1930. Since he was a little boy in Andrew, we were told that he dreamed about being a pilot. He wanted to be a pilot. Well, he was a brilliant young officer, and because of that, the Air Force selected him to go on to advanced training. He then earned a master's degree in meteorology from the University of California at Berkeley. This is while he was in the service. He got that degree in 1935. In 1937, he got a similar degree in aeronautical engineering from Capt in 1937. And all the time he was doing this, he was working full-time for the Army Air Corps at March Field in California. So professors at these two universities describe him as being perhaps the most brilliant student who ever attended their schools. He was just absolutely ingenious. And so who does that maybe remind you of that he correlates with? This is a picture of him, and this is an endorsement that they made to get a postage stamp named after him. And of course, Robert Millikan, that is his postage stamp that was printed in honor of Robert Millikan. But to me, it's just pretty incredible that two small-town boys named Robert, both brilliant, both the sons of very poor ministers, came from our county, and it's just beyond interesting. I missed something here. While our Robert Losey was at Caltech earning his degree, guess who was the head of Caltech? Robert Millikan. So you wonder, were they aware? Did they know of each other? I mean, big school, very important school, and we kind of don't know the answer to that, do we? So, but just an interesting thing to ponder. Okay, so as we move ahead from August of 1937 to January of 1940, Losey was on duty in Washington. And there he helped establish the Air Weather Service, which was a global organization, worldwide organization, and it afforded weather support to America's air and ground forces. And this is the first time we've become technological enough to really do that kind of thing, to really realize how important, or be able to understand how important the weather was to our military operations. He was served as the first chief of the weather section, and he was considered to be the Army's crack aeronautical meteorological expert. In February 1940, he then began serving as air assistant to the military attaché with the United States Embassy in Finland. And news accounts indicate that his mission was to report on air developments in the Russo-Finnish War. And I know we don't remember, but if you've read, there were really harsh winter conditions at this time. And it was a really good opportunity for our military to observe and to learn things. And so his job was to observe the interplay between the weather and military aeronautics, how this affected our ability to carry out missions and that sort of thing. So he had a first of its kind, but very important task to complete. And another reason that he was there was to help Norway's citizens flee the Nazi invasion, because this is right at the time that Hitler launched a surprise attack and took over Finland. So here we have a picture of Captain Losey with Florence Harriman. And just as the German armed forces began their Norwegian campaign to take over, he was directed to go to Sweden and then to Norway, and he was military attaché for her. She was fondly known as Daisy, and Daisy was the first woman ever to serve as an ambassador for the United States of America, the first woman that ever served. Well, he was helping her evacuate the military people, the diplomats, from our government, those sort of people, because Hitler was moving in, he was taking over. And so it was up to Captain Losey to make the arrangements for the evacuation into Sweden of the spouses and children of the embassy staff and the American delegation became divided as they were leaving. It became separated into two parties. And the first party included Losey and the minister, as you see her there, Lawrence Harriman, and they reached Sweden safely. They got out safely. But somehow they lost contact with the other half of the party, and communications were not good then. They were in a very strange place, and they did not know where they were. So Losey volunteered to go back to Norway and search for the remainder of the American delegation. Oops. So this is not a very good photograph, I'm sorry. It came from Life magazine. According to Harriman, Captain Losey dissuaded her from going with him. She felt that it was her job, that she should be the person to go along. And it was going to be she and Losey and her chauffeur in her car in this rescue effort. But he warned her, no, you can't go. You might be bombed, and the Germans are strafing the roads. Well, she reluctantly listened to him. She sent her chauffeur and him off in her car. It was draped with a large American flag strung across the top in hopes that prowling German planes might spare the vehicle if they came across it. Because remember, America then was still a neutral power. We were not at war with Germany, and so the hope was that they would not attack the car. Well, Harriman wrote a lot, and later she recounted in her book called Mission to the North what Losey told her. He said to her, and this is a quote, "I certainly don't want to be killed, but your death would be much more serious, as it might involve our country in all kinds of trouble, whereas a mere military attaché, not going to matter." So what he was pointing out was that the United States was, like I said, a neutral country. It was not involved in war, but for our country to have our ambassador discovered there would be a very dangerous thing to have happen. And he foresaw this, and he talked her out of going. So she stayed behind. So this is a photograph of Dombas Station. It's a very small village just northwest of Lillehammer. And you remember our Olympics were at Lillehammer. So you kind of know where that is. He was seeking out the missing Americans, but what he and his chauffeur didn't know is that they had already found their way safely to Sweden. Didn't know that, so he was out there looking for them and trying to rescue them. They passed through this small village, and just as they reached this railway intersection, the Germans began bombing raid. This was a really important place. It was just a crossways for all sorts of roads and trains and things, and naturally, if the Germans were going to take something out, this is what they wanted to get. So they were constantly bombing this place. Well, the two men got there just in time to unload this car, draped with the American flag. They loaded it onto a train, and as they were loading it onto the train, they just got it loaded when the air sirens started blowing and the bombers started arriving overhead. So all of the people that lived in this little village, I think it was about 600 people, I think I read, everybody ran for the railroad tunnels, because there were two railroad tunnels into the mountains, and these were the only safe places that they could go. The passengers on the trains, everybody was running into these tunnels to escape the strafing and the bombing. Losey, too, rushed to the shelter and the chauffeur. But as an Air Force officer, he lingered about 30 foot inside the entrance to the rail tunnel because he was observing the air battle that was being fought above him. That was his job, right? He was there to see how this all happened and report back so that they could better stage the war. Suddenly, a bomb exploded into the earth close by, not in the tunnel, but close by, and it just happened that it showered everything around with deadly shrapnel. One piece shot into the tunnel. It shot It went straight for Losey. We're told that it sank deeply into his chest, penetrating his heart, and he died within minutes. Even though there were doctors from the Red Cross taking shelter in the tunnel, they could not save him. And some reports say that he was killed instantly, some say that he died a few minutes later, but there was no way to help him. In addition to Losey, 29 Norwegians were killed, and there were many people that were wounded. So this was indeed a very tragic thing. So once Losey's body then made it to Sweden, a memorial service was held, and it was reported on the radio by a war correspondent quite famous by the name of Arthur Mencken. And on April 23rd of 1940, this story appeared on the front page of the New York Times. This was not a little thing, this was a really big deal. Florence Harriman, our ambassador, wrote, "All of our hearts ached for the young wife in California who must go on without him." She would hear of his service, the memorial service that they held was on the radio. She would hear this on the radio. She would read the tributes, but according to Harriman, she would not have the picture of he and his friends this last winter, the people who mourned him in the north. Captain Losey's wife was Kay. Her name was Catherine Banta. When she heard the news of his death, she collapsed. They had been married for 7 years. She was living in California waiting for him to come home. They had no children, but it was very, very hard for her. Several days after the attack, oh, and I might say at the same time, we saw his sister, Margaret, that grew up with him and Andrew, or that lived with him and Andrew. She was not even contacted by the military, by anyone, to tell her that her brother died. She was working in her kitchen when the news came over the radio, and that's how she found out that her brother had been killed. And she was devastated because from the age of 12, he'd been the man of the family, and he had taken care of her, and she was just really, really devastated by that. Okay, so several days after the attack, Luftwaffe Commander Hermann Göring sent flowers and a note of condolence to Major General Arnold and a message of regret about Losey's death. And it's a documented fact that this happened. They also believe, but it's not quite as well documented, that Adolf Hitler did the same. And why did they do that? Because this was a very, very serious political issue. Germany did not want the United States of America to have an excuse to join in the war against them. So they were trying to smooth things over, trying to make nice. It wasn't until 20 months later, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, 20 minutes after this man died, that the United States declared war. So in 1940, the year that this happened, the Institute of Aeronautical Sciences created a Robert M. Losey Award. In 1975, they changed it to the Losey Atmospheric Sciences Award in his honor. And then the following year, they named an Army airfield in Puerto Rico after him. A legendary filmmaker named Frank Capra included an account in his death in a War Department movie that they made entitled Divide and Conquer. That's kind of what happened at the time. This is at West Point. He said he was a graduate at West Point. He was laid to rest at West Point. His mother was buried next to him. And then he was just kind of forgotten for a very long time. And I would just have to say, sometimes we're not as good at recognizing our own heroes as the rest of the world is in recognizing our heroes. And again, Robert Millikan is a case in point. The whole world knows about Robert Millikan and what he did, and yet so few people, even in our county, know. And that's really sad. He was laid to rest at West Point, and the military academy did write a magnificent book, and I've not seen this book, but it supposedly was wonderful, about the life of a brilliant young man born in Andrew, Iowa, whom the military had a fast track on to become a brigadier general, and all the many things that he had accomplished in his short 33 years was compiled by his family and brought to the Historical Society. In 1987, citizens of Dalmas, where the tunnel was, where he died, erected an 8-foot memorial to Captain Losey. On the 50th anniversary on April 21st of 1990, some 400 Norwegians turned out for a memorial service and laid wreaths in front of his monument in his honor. And it's interesting because at the time this happened, the people there didn't seem to know about any relatives in this country. And the relatives in this country didn't seem to know anything about this wonderful memorial that was built in his memory, until all of a sudden a random article ran in 1994 during the U.S., and it was in USA Today paper, and it was while the Olympics were underway in nearby Lillehammer. And the writer, and the writer that was covering the events thought, and it was read at this, but he published it, and it was read by a cousin of the family in an Arby's restaurant in Lynchburg, Virginia. And she thought to herself, gee, this story sounds very familiar. Well, long story short, during the figure skating events of the Olympics of that year, there were a lot of phone calls and faxes going back and forth between the family here and people there. And finally, things came together, and the people there knew about the relatives here, and they all began to get together and put the pieces together. This is a park in Dalmas, park in Norway, that was dedicated by Norwegian royalty to Captain Losey. He is their hero. He is a great hero in Norway, and they see it as him giving his life to help Norwegians escape to safety into Sweden. And at the time, members of Losey's family, at the time of this, they had gotten in contact. And so there is his sister and cousins and nephews that attended the dedication of the park. So as we move ahead to, well, this was Vera Rambo did this for our display, because there's a display of him in the other museum. So that just kind of brings you up to date with kind of a timeline of things that he did in his short life. And you can just imagine what he might have accomplished if he had lived. But in 2006, Captain Losey was nominated by the Jackson County Historical Society to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. And there you see Wanda Cornelius. She was there representing the Historical Society and representing Andrew. And she told his story as he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. The man sitting next to him is Captain Losey's nephew, Bob Lee, and he came for the induction ceremony. And we know that, and I talked to Doug Noble about this story because he wrote some articles about it, and Lowell Carlson, we know, wrote an article. Lowell actually interviewed several members of the family. This was back in the 90s when he would have done this. And the family all remembered here, they didn't know him, but they all remembered stories of him being the first American killed in World War II, and they all knew that he was, by all accounts, extremely brilliant. But the thing that made me feel a little bad was all of the family said they had this saying, curiosity killed the cat, and Bob Losey too. And to me, that just says that they don't really understand what he did. And I think that I hope that's not true, if that's the way it sounds. It's just that. It's a fact that instead of running deeper into the tunnel, and they accused him of sitting there just because he was curious and wanted to see what was happening, he felt duty-bound to document the attack for his superiors. That's what he was there for. And he left himself in harm's way to do that. I hope his family understands that. He just had a deep devotion to do Florence Harriman wrote later, "The sense of loss in the world was centered in one young American." Well, I talked to Doug this morning. Do you want to tell us a little bit that you remember? I texted Doug late last night, so this is news to him. He didn't have time to go back and look much up, but he was involved in this, and I just thought maybe he would share a little bit.
I don't think I can really add anything to what you said, Bonnie. I can just say that I was at the newspaper one day, couldn't even tell you what year in the 90s, maybe 94 is when the first story. I don't have the story, and just totally out of the blue, I received a phone call from a person. All I can remember is somewhere in I think New York or the East Coast, and he said, "I have a question for you. Does the name Robert Losey mean anything?" And I said, "No, never heard that name before." And he proceeded to tell me that he was doing research, and that Losey is considered the first American casualty of World War II, and was telling me of some of this, and it sounded all legit, but I said, I don't think, and he said, it's our understanding he was born in Andrew, and apparently he had looked up the newspaper closest to Andrew, Iowa, and probably how I happened to get the call. And I talked to him for some time about it, and I think I did some other research. I believe I contacted the Presbyterian Church, which I think is not. I think it's since closed, I believe, there. But talked to somebody there and found out just where the parsonage would have been, which is a house that, as far as I know, is still there, kind of across from the church, and presumably where he was born. I don't know. I found documented written proof or a birth certificate, but presumably he was born in the house as people would have been in. But he was born 1908, I think, it was quite a revelation. And I said that I don't think anyone in this area, to my knowledge, is aware of this. And as far as I know, there's nothing in Andrew, a plaque or anything that commemorates him as the birthplace. So that's, I think, how I first became aware, and anyone else. And then you said Lowell did go on and do some, get in touch with some of the remaining surviving relatives.
Okay. Thank you so much. And like I say, I really sprung this on Doug. He did not have, because I didn't know until last night that he had gotten the phone call. So thank you. I appreciate that very much. Well, the man who contacted Doug, that he didn't have a chance to look up his name was Keith Feynman, and he was again from Lynchburg, Virginia, where this lady was eating in the Arby's when she got the news. They must have known each other. And he did start doing research, and he's credited with putting together the missing pieces of Losey's career. And so without this man, I don't think we would even today know very much about this, or maybe nothing about this. And then I commented to Doug that in our file, in our research file, we have an editorial from June 5th of 1999 that Bob Melville wrote. And there's so much information in his editorials. They were awesome. So I'm trying to convince Doug that he needs to write a book, put together a book of all of his dad's editorials, because they were amazing. But this is the one that he wrote on this occasion. He told of walking through the Andrews Cemetery with Francis during the annual Briggs Memorial Day celebration. And it was, of course, honoring our first governor, Ansel Briggs, as well as Lawrence Van Hook, and who was one of 4 Revolutionary War soldiers that is buried in the cemetery at Andrews. And as he walked around, he wondered why he couldn't find a memorial to Robert Losey, because he by then knew. And he talked to everybody he could find in the cemetery, and like Doug said, no one knew. No one knew about this. No one knew of him. And it's just kind of sad. But this is typical Robert Noel. Like he said, quote, I heard a quail calling between the taps that were being played for these Revolutionary War soldiers, for all the soldiers. And he said, at that time I wondered, maybe the quail persistently calling during the reading of the names was trying to tell us something. How about mentioning Captain Losey? And that just kind of gives me chills when I read that, because certainly we should all know that name. And so then I tried to find out if anything had happened in the Andrews Cemetery about this, and I couldn't find anybody who knew of any plaque. I mean, obviously he's buried at West Point, but wouldn't it be nice to have a plaque or a stone or something in the Andrews Cemetery, just remembering this man and the things that he did. And again, it reminds me of Robert Milken, Nobel Prize winner from a small town like Maquoketa. It's just unheard of. And yet we have almost nothing here to remind us of that great man and the things that he did. So anyway, that's my story. I hope everybody will remember Robert, especially this month, because like I say, it was April 21st of 1940 when he gave his life, but how important that was. But I'd just like to, if I don't think I have, oops, okay. Another topic, okay? Andrews Cemetery. So this is just kind of a heads up of something that's coming up. An Andrews Cemetery event, and we're just waiting to hear more about this. But as you can see, there's a monument here. It's a monument for a veteran of World War XII. And it's been found by this young couple in a garage in Indianola, Iowa. Well, they bought this property online, so they've got nobody to go back to say, what's the story on this? So they begin tracking it down to try to see where this tombstone belonged. And of course, they found that it belongs in Jackson County, Iowa. So the tombstone is of Moses Littlefield. I don't know if you can read that. Died in 1878 at the age of 88 years of age. And he was, he served in the War of 1812. He lived, of course, out east in that time, but he ended up probably getting land grants from the government for his service. And he had a large farm near the Poor Farm in Andrew, or the county farm in Andrew. He and his wife lived there for some time, raised their children, and they were buried on that farm. So there was the Littlefield Farm Cemetery. And the Pioneer Cemetery Commission has that cemetery listed, but it just says, way over to the right, move. Well, they moved the cemetery. Did they move everybody? Did they, we don't really know yet what that is. We do know that Andrew had a very beloved doctor by the name of Dr. Samuel Littlefield, who would be a grandson of Moses Littlefield. But right now, and a lot of groups are involved in this, the Pioneer Cemetery Commission and the Jackson County Historic Preservation Commission, we're all trying to get this tombstone back to Jackson County at least. And then when we get it back here, we have to find out what are we going to do with it. This is in the Andrews Cemetery, a stone for the Littlefield family. This is more for Dr. Samuel Littlefield, the grandson. On the back of this stone, but it didn't show up because of the shadows, Moses Littlefield's name is listed on the back of the stone, and then there are several small stones behind it. But we're hopeful that we can get together the money or whatever it takes and maybe put this, let's see if I can go back, put this stone in the cemetery with the other stones so that they'll all be together. But so something that we're just looking at, working on, and I think the only other thing we maybe know about Moses Littlefield is that he donated the land for what is the Poor Farm Cemetery, the cemetery that's at the county farm. He donated that land, so his farm was adjoining that land. So don't know much about him yet, but we're researching. If anyone wants to help, you're more than welcome. But just kind of a fun thing, since we're touching on the Andrews Cemetery in a lot of ways today. So, anybody have any comments?
Did they find other stones that moved and they only found one?
In Indianola, they just found the one stone. And on the Littlefield farm, there's no longer anything. So, we don't know at what point the burials were moved from there to the Andrews Cemetery. We don't really know whether they just moved the stones, whether hopefully they moved everything. We don't really know, so we're trying to figure that out. We don't know the time period when it was moved. I think the only thing we know for sure is because of the WPA records. We know that in 1942, probably, the Littlefield stone was still on the farm and still readable. So we know it was after 1940, but we don't know when it got transferred. But wouldn't you think that the stone belongs in the Andrews Cemetery since the farm has been sold and everything? But anyway, I'm sure you'll be hearing more about this story as it goes along. We've been trying to figure out how to get the stone from Indianola to here. Don Wentworth figured out that Buck Hoos has a daughter that lives near there, so the hope and the dream is that she's picking up the stone from the porch of this lady who called us, because the lady is now in some foreign country. Albania. She's now in Albania. Thank you. She's now in Albania. So she said, it'll just be covered on my porch, just come and pick it up. It looks fairly large, but she said it's only a couple inches thick. So she said 2 people can easily lift it, just needs to fit in the back of a van and be brought back here. So hopefully Buck Hoos is going to help get the stone back. If not, this very nice lady said that when she gets back from Albania, that she will bring it as far as Iowa City, if we can meet her in Iowa City, and that's certainly doable. So anyway, it should be a fun thing to investigate and see where that goes. That's all I have to say. So thank you very much.